Hello, hi everyone, and I'm Stefano Vannucci. I work for the Middle East Directions program. Welcome and thanks for joining our roundtable today on Covid-19 and the MENA conflicts. How has the MENA region faced the Covid-19 pandemic? Our four distinguished speakers will have 10 minutes each to present, and this session will be video recorded and disseminated, while the Q&A will go under Chatham House rule. So we kindly ask our audience to wait for the Q&A to type their questions on the chat. And now the floor goes to Virginie Colombier, which will moderate this roundtable. Thanks.
Thank you, Stefano, and thank you all for joining, and good afternoon. I'm happy to have you here as part of this probably the last one of the year, the Middle East Directions Roundtable. We are entering into July, and I think we will probably have other events now later on in September, but we thought it was very important to maybe reflect a bit further on how the MENA region has been reacting to the COVID-19 crisis, even though we can probably say that the crisis is far from over, and in many countries of the region, probably in contrast to what happened in other other regions of the globe, we're still in a phase of increase in terms of spread of the virus. So we thought it was very important to reflect, analyze what's been going on, and we would try in this particular roundtable to have a look at a number of countries in the region and analyze how they have addressed the crisis and addressed the pandemic, managed the crisis in different ways, with also different results and different levels of success. I'm very happy here today to have with us four experts who will bring different perspectives and different expertise on the region, and especially on a few countries of the region. The idea, as I said, is to have, to some extent, a comparative approach, but also to look at the ways management has been implemented and try to start already reflect on the next steps and to discuss prospects for the region, both at the political and economic level. I think we also see the same phenomenon happening in Europe, in the US, in other areas of the globe. The health crisis has also started triggering a number of economic effects, but also political effects. So we will try as much as possible, even though it's probably quite early, but to try and start discussing some of the possible outcomes, or at least trends that we see emerging at the regional level. I'm happy here to introduce you to our four speakers. Nedra Sherif, who is a well-known figure here at the UI. She's a PhD researcher in political science, and she's been focusing mostly on the political transition in Tunisia since 2011. Mohamed Afan, who is a research fellow and the current acting research director at the Sharq Forum, is also a PhD candidate at the University of Exeter in the UK. Cyril Wetershoven, who is an energy market expert and Middle East specialist, working for a number of consulting firms and analysis firms also, especially with a focus on energy and energy markets. And Sami Zuhaib, who is a public policy researcher at the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies, LCPS. So each of them will shed light on developments on specific countries. After the short presentations that each of them will give, we'll try to also start linking between the various cases, and as much as possible have a discussion in which you will all be welcome to participate. I'll stop here and immediately give the floor to Nedra Sherif to try and shed light on what's been happening in Tunisia over the past months. Thank you. Go ahead, Nedra.
Thank you, Virginie, and thanks for having me in this discussion. So here I'll be talking about Tunisia, and Tunisia has been widely described as a success story in fighting the coronavirus. This is what has been described internationally, but this is also the national narrative. On 14th of June, the Prime Minister, Elias El Farfer, indeed announced the country's victory over the Covid-19, and he decided to remove the last confinement measures for the mere reason that Tunisia had not registered, well, they had registered almost no new case of COVID for more than a week. And indeed, when we look at the figures of the spread of the virus in Tunisia, we know that the country has done pretty well in fighting the spread of the virus. To date, we have only 1,188 cases registered with 50 deaths, and 3 governorates out of 24 which are completely free of the virus. So obviously Tunisia has done well, at least if we look at the country in a comparative perspective and looking at other MENA countries, maybe with the exception of Jordan, which is doing quite well. We can say that Tunisia has done well, but also if we compare it to Europe, in particular to France and Italy, and I know we are focusing here on MENA, but I wanted to mention these 2 countries for a specific reason. First, the geographical proximity with Tunisia, the important economic ties between Tunisia and these countries, but also the fact that there have been a kind of focus for the Tunisian authorities in the way they elaborated their strategy to fight the COVID-19. First, as I said, because they were seeing, during the whole period, they were watching them and seeing their countries with strong medical capacities completely collapsing. So basically, Europe and France and Italy in particular were the models that should not be followed, the thing that should be avoided. So it was interesting to look at the measures they had taken, but to reproduce them in Tunisia, but in a more anticipated way. And the second reason why I'm mentioning these countries is because they have been regarded as also a source of potential contamination for Tunisia. At the beginning of the crisis, like the other neighbors of Tunisia had no registered cases, and the fact that they have strong connection with these countries of the northern shore of the Mediterranean meant that the imported cases would most probably come from Europe. So they were scrutinized very closely by the authorities. So basically, can we speak about Tunisian success? As I said, comparatively, yes, with at least a success or a victory in the first phase of the COVID-19 crisis. Obviously, we only past first phase, but not the crisis is not yet over. And I think we need to be careful about using the term success. I know, like analysts and external observers that like to look for success stories, and Tunisia is always, the bright spot in the region for its success in its political transition, in its democratization process, and well, for the COVID, it looked like a good case as well. But I'll try here to bring a few nuances to to this concept. I'd like to focus just on a few points. First of all, what were the reasons that enabled Tunisia to to overcome this first stage of the crisis in a rather good manner, but also to look at what did not really work properly or what could have be done better, and maybe briefly look into the future and at the coming risks for the next phase, especially in terms of economic crisis, but also the risk of a second wave, which has been a concern for the Tunisian experts for the last few weeks. But maybe before starting and entering into the heart of the topic, just give you to make a short reminder of the political situation in which the COVID crisis started in Tunisia, since it's quite important. This background is quite important. As most of you know, Tunisia has had general election at the end of 2019, which resulted in the election of an independent president with no party to back him in parliament, and also a very fragmented parliament with mostly new political forces. Meaning that the composition of the new cabinet was extremely tough, negotiations were arduous, and the first initiative led by the Islamist party failed in January. A second attempt under the lead of current Prime Minister Elias Farfer, which was a choice of the president this time, not of the Islamist party, eventually succeeded after very, very complex negotiation. And we eventually had a government at the end of February, meaning that at the start of the crisis, the first case of COVID was officially registered on the 2nd of March. The government was barely taking its marks and starting to work. It was a very heterogeneous government, not strongly backed by a solid coalition, but a coalition where parties did not really trust each other. So it was probably not the best condition to enter the crisis. And yet, surprisingly, this government managed to control, let's say, the propagation of the virus. So what were the reasons for this success? First of all, I think the strategy that has been elaborated by the authorities was extremely anticipated. It's important to note that from the outset, the COVID crisis has been taken very seriously by the authorities. It may sound like a very basic statement, but actually, when we look at what happened in other countries, in other parts of the world, and including in countries, so-called developed countries, we realize that it's not so obvious. So the authorities took the matter very seriously. Once the first cases were registered outside of China, Tunisia put in place a national committee against the COVID. An expert committee was end of January, so even before the setting up of the cabinet. It's important to note. And this committee was tasked to monitor and to evaluate the progress of the situation outside of the country and prepare the country for a potential response. As soon as the government was in place, it created as well an interministerial committee to monitor the situation, and which worked very closely with the committee of experts. There was an extremely good working relationship between the political sphere and the scientific experts, which means that the preparation, the anticipation were really the key word, the key instrument in the fight against the COVID-19. And the main reason for that is that there was a clear awareness in Tunisia that the country could not basically could not cope with a major crisis, simply had no sufficient resources, especially medical capacities, to face a large-scale pandemic. So the idea was really to anticipate and prevent as much as possible, first the entry of the virus into the country, and once it was in the country, to prevent its propagation, especially in the internal region of the country, which lack medical capacities and infrastructure. So as I said, there was an anticipation, there was a good relation between the experts and the politicians. So what does it mean concretely? It means that since the first case was registered on the 2nd of March, the authorities were not really taken by surprise. They had the time to prepare a comprehensive strategy, which included a number of measures that were implemented in a gradual manner. First, controlling the entries on the territories with sanitary measures on the border points, then reducing the flights from Europe, from China, and eventually deciding the closure of the borders on 16th of March. Internally, there was also a number of measures to limit the propagation of the virus by limiting the possibilities for people to gather, the reducing of working hours in offices, forbidding public prayers, closing shops and coffees and restaurants earlier, then a curfew decided by the president a couple of days later. But all of these measures, which were gradually implemented, were done extremely early. This was mid-March. We had only 24 cases registered, no deaths. So some people would say it was quite early, but this was part of the strategy of anticipation of the government. A number of also preparation on the medical, at the medical level were done, with the hospitals preparing to receive the patients in coordination with the Ministry of Health, in coordination with the experts, was ready from the start. A number of socio-economic measures to prevent aspects, or to limit as much as possible the possible consequences of the crisis, especially on low-income and middle-income households. And eventually, an important point was that this early organization also enabled a sharing of information and transparency in the information that was crucial to be able to respond quickly to any new developments. So there were regular briefings by the Ministry of Health, and people were informed regularly on the evolution of the situation, but also they were also informed on the measures they had to take, distanciation and so on and so forth. So overall, there was a comprehensive strategy that worked quite well. The other important factor, I would say, on the political front was the fact that I would say it was not a proper political unity around the government. It was more like I would say, a tacit truce between the government and the opposition. There were, interestingly, and despite the hard negotiation to put in place the cabinet, we know that during this period there have been very few, almost no criticism or contestations of the measures taken by the government. There were obviously criticism here and there in the media, but nothing was coming like official statement by parties contesting the way the government was addressing and managing the crisis. Interestingly, the other point of importance at the political level, it was a good working relationship between the two heads of the executive, between the president and prime minister, which is something rare. It did not happen in the previous under the previous presidency of late Beji Qaid Sabsi. And I would say that during this period, there were political tensions on other issues, but not on COVID-19. It was important to enable the government, to let the government work properly and efficiently. And I would say the only major political tension happened when the prime minister requested from the parliament the possibility to rule by decree law in order to facilitate the decision-making process. The parliament feared to be sidelined, and there was some hard discussion, but at the end they agreed, although they limited the powers of the prime minister to a number of specific sectors related to the crisis, and not giving him full powers. And the last element that, in my view, was also important, is often forgotten. It's the popular mobilization during the crisis. It was not, the success is not only the result of the work of the politician and the work of the expert, but also of the work of the civil society, of the youth who have mobilized from the beginning, whether on their own initiative or in coordination with local and national authorities, often with limited resources. They've taken many initiatives in different sectors, whether to help produce, masks, protection material for hospitals, to collect funds, to distribute food supplies to needy families, to organize awareness campaigns, and to encourage citizens to comply with the lockdown measures. There have been a real movement of solidarity, which was extremely useful in helping to fill the gaps and the deficiencies of the state and the public systems. The state was obviously doing its work, but in view of the last years of where there have been, during the political transition, it's been complicated for the state to provide at all levels, and the role of the civil society has been extremely important in this period. Now, looking at the let's say what didn't really work, or how we could nuance a bit of this success, I would say that we've seen the problem of Tunisia was not really its lack of anticipation or the lack of good measures. I think that the measures were good at least on paper, they were good. The problem was Tunisia suffers from a number of structural problems that eventually limited or somehow hampered the effective implementation of these measures. Just mention a few points here. The measures, I would say, were taken often in the abstract and lacked a bit of a connection with the local reality, which is something that has been a reproach made to the political class. It's disconnection with the field, the problem that it's a historical problem in Tunisia, the problem of centralization of power in the capital, and the lack of decentralization, and the not leaving enough margin of power to local authorities to address the issues, and the problem of a dysfunctional public administration also to implement the measures. I'm just going to mention a few examples. Well, first of all, the socio-economic measures taken by the government, the fact of imposing a full lockdown starting for the 20th of March was not necessarily adapted to a socio-economic reality where 32% of the workforce is involved in the informal sector, where lots of households rely on daily jobs. You cannot prevent people basically to go out and look for jobs just to feed themselves, if even if there is a virus outside, even if there are confinement measures. Yep.
Can just try and shorten a bit, just to make sure that we all have enough time to proceed. Sorry.
Sure. So yeah, so I'll go quickly on the difficult implementation of the measures. One more difficulties was the food distribution and financial distribution to support a needed family. It's been quite complex to implement, and maybe we'll go back on this in the discussion. So just to keep it short, the problem, there have been a number of implementation issues, and at this point, once the Prime Minister again announced the victory on COVID-19, at this point there have been no critical assessment of the whole strategy and what has worked well and what did not work well, while we need to prepare for potential second wave of COVID-19. This is an assessment that needs to be done before, as soon as possible. Just a few words, I don't want to keep it too long, into the coming problems or difficulties that Tunisia will be faced with. First of all, and as everywhere, an economic crisis that no country will escape, but it's going to be probably even worse in Tunisia, which has been suffering from very fragile economic situation over the last decades and since the 2011 uprising. The problem is that the previous governments have failed to implement serious socio-economic reforms, and it's going to be even more difficult in the current context to do so. We've seen recently troubles happening again because of unemployment, because of economic problems like in Tatawin recently. So obviously it's going to make it even more complicated for the government to go into this crucial socio-economic reforms, and whether the government, the political class will remain united in the elaboration and the implementation of a recovery plan. And the second risk, obviously, is a second wave of COVID-19. The country has reopened its borders since the 27th of June. But it's extremely concerned of the potential of imported cases. There are very strict measures being implemented. Countries basically of arrival have been classified into different categories with specific measures to be implemented to each, the green countries, the orange countries, and the red countries. But it's extremely complex for a country which highly relies on tourism to say, okay, I'm not going to open my borders. So the idea was to try to find a balance between two strict measures to prevent the return of the COVID and two flexible measures, just as a way not to discourage potential visitors to come to Tunisia. I just conclude in a few words saying that obviously Tunisia has done well in the first phase of the struggle against the COVID-19, but it was just a first battle. It's not the whole war, and the risks are real that we could see a resurgence of the COVID-19 in the country. There are economic and social risks that are there, and the question is whether the government and the political class as a whole will be able to maintain this momentum of brief unity to cope with a potential second crisis. In view of the recent political tensions we've seen in Tunisia, I'm a bit skeptical, but let's hope that that the next stage will be as successful as the first one. And I stop here.
Thank you, Nedra. I think you've done a great job trying to present a very broad overview of the success, or at least what worked well and what was a bit more problematic, or what might become a bit problematic in the longer run. So I'm sure that there are a number of points that can be discussed further, especially in view of comparing with the other cases. I will immediately ask Mohammed to provide also his input, and I think he will focus mostly on the case of Egypt, which probably provides an interesting counter view of what has been happening in terms of management and success so far. Thank you. The floor to you, Mohammed.
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you for having me. Today, inshallah, I will talk specifically on the case of Egypt. And my approach will focus mainly on the idea of legitimacy, political legitimacy, not just to evaluate the efficiency of the public policies, but exactly how the COVID-19 in different ways affected of the regime in Egypt. The argument here is like that. First, authoritarian regimes, the core of its legitimacy is based on its performance or its efficiency. And COVID-19 challenges the efficiency of the government at different levels, providing healthcare, decently, even keeping the political stability. But on the other hand, it gave the government a break for taking more authoritarian measures and to be more invasive for the society. So the idea here that COVID-19, the impact of COVID-19 on authoritarian regimes, such as Egypt, has a dual effect and maybe conflicting effects. First, it changed its legitimacy because it changed its performance, but on the other hand, it gave it the chance to be more and if we go further, we can find some sort of inverse relationship between both aspects. I mean, the more the regime vulnerability is exposed, the more it becomes more authoritarian and it becomes more repressing to the media, civil society, political parties, and other actors. So there is some sort of correlation between the efficiency of the regime in the time of crisis, between the efficiency of the regime and its authoritarian measures. The more it's vulnerable, the more its vulnerability is exposed, the more it's authoritarian. Moving to the first question, how COVID-19 challenged the Egyptian government or the Egyptian regime's performance or efficiency, we have here four fields of challenge. The first, of course, healthcare system. Now the regime is asked to provide its citizens with decent healthcare, and given that the healthcare infrastructure in Egypt is not functioning well, because if we use all parameters mentioned by the WHO, we will find that, for example, the health expenditure is lower than 5.3% of GDP. The number of doctors or the number of available hospitals for 10,000 inhabitants are fairly low. So first, there is a change here, how the regime could face, how can the regime improve the performance of its healthcare system and keep this system functioning. The second level, of course, is the economic consequences. As you know, the COVID-19 had a great impact on the economy. It caused economic slowdown and of course, but the point here that Egypt is specifically more vulnerable due to many factors. Just I will mention three of these factors. First, tourism, of course, because more than 10%, maybe 12% of Egyptian GDP is based on tourism. Second, remittances. Egypt also, for more than 10% of its GDP is dependent on the money transfer from foreign Egyptian workers into their homeland. And third, the huge informal economy in Egypt. And some estimations said that the informal economy in Egypt exceeds 60%. And the number of daily workers in Egypt is about 12 million. So, of course, workers in this sector are more vulnerable and more exposed to the consequences of the COVID-19. There is no health insurance, they are not legally protected, so they can be fired easily without any rights. So the economic challenge really is something very important, of course, worldwide, but with special importance also in Egypt. The third level could be described as the ability of the regime to infiltrate the society, which means, of course, the regime had to take many exceptional measures, like curfews, like surveillance, or imposing some measures for social distancing. And the change here, to what extent the regime is able to impose these measures. So the penetration way, how can the regime impose laws and impose these exceptional measures efficiently in the society? And of course, this was a great challenge. To what extent the people will react or will respond positively with the regime's instructions or measures for social distancing or stop praying in mosques or church. All these measures expose the degree of the regime ability to organize, to infiltrate and organize the society, maybe from within. And the fourth level is controlling the public sphere. Because, of course, as we said, the image of the regime is very important for keeping its legitimacy. So the regime was very keen to keep its official rhetoric on the crisis as the dominant rhetoric. And of course, in the time of crisis, you can easily find people on social media or even in media outlets releasing some data or describing some problems here and there in this hospital or in that place. And the regime was challenged by that, because the regime was keen to keep his dominance and his control over the public sphere. So we can, to summarize, we can see that there are four challenges to the authoritarian regime, or namely Egyptian regime in this case, in the time of crisis. First, providing the service, healthcare service. Second, to absorb the backlash and the consequences of the economic slowdown. Third, to efficiently penetrate and organize and guide maybe the society from within by giving, by imposing some special measures or taking some, or giving nationwide instructions on social distancing. And the fourth, to keep its control over the public sphere and to control or maybe monopolize the data source in this time. The regime, how did the regime respond? The regime responded by two strategies. First, the regime strived to increase its efficiency in all these levels, in healthcare system, in healthcare system, in economy, and its control in media. But on the other hand, the regime also used many authoritarian measures, especially after its initial initiatives failed to be efficient in facing this crisis. So we can mention many measures taken by the regime to increase its efficiency, like in healthcare system. They, of course, designated many hospitals, tens of hospitals, and quarantine centers. Also established some field hospitals. They took, of course, many preventive measures, like shut down the schools, universities, shopping malls, and all the routine measures, suspending international flights. But the interesting thing here that the regime didn't choose to impose a full lockdown at any time, even at the highest peak of the crisis, because the economic issue was very, very pressing on the regime. And the third, measures regarding economy. As I said, the regime, as much as the regime can, started to support the economy, but at the end, it was forced to submit for two loans from IMF in the past few weeks. One for $2.8 billion, and the second for $5.2 billion. And for the media and the data, the regime followed very efficient communication, established very efficient communication channels by having reports, daily press conferences, and also established like applications and websites. So all these measures were an regime efficiency. But of course, as I said before, after a few weeks, vulnerability and the performance of the regime showed to be inefficient in facing this crisis. So the hospitals were, the capacity of the hospitals were filled in only a few weeks. On social media, the social media platforms were plagued by people asking for help and asking for anyone who can find a place in isolation hospitals or whatever. And of course, on the social media and even in some media outlets, people start to release some huge numbers about cases and mortality rates. So the regime opted for the second option, which is increase its authoritarian tools and authoritarian measures. So just in short, the changes the emergency law, which is it was the regime also indications in this law. Also, they increased the penalties of spreading rumors and fake news, and they started to target some not only social media activists, but even some members of the medical syndicate councils, and they arrested them, accusing them of spreading some rumors. And also, the last thing that I want to finish here, that also took some measures to make pressure on the opposition by restricting the measures on the detainees, political prisoners, by denying them their right for routine visits or renewing their pre-trial detention without even having a chance to defend themselves. So at the end, the regime followed two measures, one to increase its efficiency, but at the end it proved not efficient enough. Then it increased its authoritarian tools by enacting more repressive laws, imposing more control in media, and targeting more dissent voices, even if they are healthcare workers. And just to evaluate, till now, these measures are working for the regime. The overall image and the overall legitimacy are still there. But of course, in the future, with the if second wave happened, and or if the economic consequences were too bad to be absorbed by the regime, I think the whole situation will change in the near future. And I will leave it here, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. I think it's quite interesting to see in both cases, Tunisia and Egypt, we have this idea that, okay, so far the situation has been to some extent controlled, even though with major differences between the two countries, but the uncertainty on what happens if the situation deteriorates again. So I think it's an important point that we probably have to discuss in the Q&A that follows. I would like now immediately to ask Cyril to join and to jump in and talk about what's been happening in Saudi Arabia over the past few months. And same thing, I mean, what can be the prospects in the longer run? And I think you both already have included a political dimension to the analysis, but also the economy is something which is going to play an important role. And I think in Saudi Arabia, we'll have a further illustration of this. Cyril, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to be focusing on Saudi. I've prepared some slides also, which I'm going to try to share. Let's see. Share the screen. So that's an option. Are you seeing my screen? Or are you not? You are not able to. Could you, Stefano, could you try to see if I can share my screen, please? And you're on mute, so I'm not hearing what you're saying now.
Stefano, are you on it?
Yes, sure. I was writing on the chat to Cyril.
Okay, great. Okay, I'm not able to. Okay. Then I'll address it out of my head. The situation in Saudi is a little bit different from Tunisia and Egypt, because the COVID is still in its first wave. There is no real sign yet that COVID is being slowed down. However, in stark contrast to, let's say, Italy, Spain, England, the Netherlands, and the USA, COVID in Saudi has not yet reached the mortality rate as we have seen. We are still in Saudi at less than 0.6% of, okay, this is not saying it's going extremely well, but mortality rate in Saudi is reasonably low. The amount of COVID victims stands now, I think, at 211,000, with 1,916 casualties. The reason behind that is that more or less, and that's the main difference with Egypt, at least, the Saudi healthcare situation is a little bit different than in Egypt. There are a lot of hospitals available, and they are also reasonably functioning well. The reason that COVID in Saudi is not yet on its way down, I think it's mainly because, and that's again a difference with and Tunisia and Egypt and Saudi. There are not only Saudis, but there are also a lot of non-Saudis. And even that the healthcare system is open to all, the impact of the Saudi government on putting in place the measures that need to be done to keep COVID out are reasonably easy to be done in the Saudi areas, but it's hard to be done with expats housing in caravans meant for 4 people, and you have there 16 or 20 or 24 people. So social distancing in certain areas is a real issue, and I do understand that in Egypt it's also not always easy, in Shubra or wherever, but housing of expats, it's a real issue. Where there is a major impact, and yes, we have been focusing on that in the media, the toxic mix between COVID and demand destruction for oil and gas is in Saudi a real issue, which has its negative impact even on Egypt and Tunisia and also on Lebanon, because the revenue streams that expats are able or were able to generate in Saudi or the UAE or Qatar is under pressure, because as we all know, GCC countries, even that the structure is well done and the finances are still not really under pressure, the first move they always make is to see if they are not able to address economic downturn by removing part of the expat population. The clear approach to that is in Kuwait, which has officially stated that no expats are anymore going to be working for government entities. Now, in how far that is an option for Saudi, the UAE or Qatar, I don't think so, because without expats, even after years of economic diversification, expats are still holding a slight amount of the economic strength. Engineers and doctors and teachers are still mostly expat. In Saudi, mostly Egyptian or Lebanese, but by bringing the social structure to a lockdown and your economy is being hit by an possible loss of 10 billion or 20 billion US dollars a month in revenues due to a lower oil price. It has been crunch time. Saudi has not yet engaged in removing, let's say, large parts of the expats. It's also keeping its finances reasonably at level, and that's because it's able, in contrast to Egypt or the other ones, to finance either from its own reserves or enter the financial markets and easily get some additional finance. Saudi is still looking at a potential GDP loss between 6.4 and 7.9% of GDP. And that's in the end, and the end is not yet there. It's going to be putting an increased pressure on the Saudi government, the Saudi royal family, to find a solution for a situation that they do not yet have a solution for. Even that finances are there, the future of relying on a still largely hydrocarbon-based economy is under pressure, while their plans to diversify their economy, the so-called Saudi Vision 2030, is also under pressure, because the major projects that were planned, Qiddiya, Alama, Neom, etc. are needing to be financed by FDI. And FDI, as we know, in a COVID era, FDI will become money we invest in our own country and not anywhere else. So there is a slight conflict brewing between the need to change the economy, need to change the social structure, need to integrate women, and whatever people are saying, Saudi is changing with its ups and downs. There is a need of 6 million new jobs while unemployment is growing up. And unemployment brings also, again, additional risk to a re-emergence of COVID, because when you need to stay home and you are forced to be in certain areas, then spreading the virus is reasonably easy. And whatever people are saying, it's easier to have social distancing or lockdowns in Italy or in the Netherlands than to bring a lockdown 24 hours a day, not from 8 o'clock in the morning to 8 o'clock in the evening, than in Egypt or in Saudi. The social structure is different. The social way of interaction is different. It's harder, and people still, at least in Saudi, still have the idea that COVID is not as extreme as that we, well, at least in Italy, you have seen. So to implement a continuing lockdown in Saudi, it's extremely hard, while being confronted by the fact that not only your economy is being hit, but we're not talking about the democratically organized government system. If the revenues and the state options of a government are being hit, your political stability is also being hit. And then looking at the whole region, it will have its negative repercussions on the situation in Iraq, in Lebanon. We will hear it also, because if Lebanon normally had an issue, Saudis would be asking for retribution, but would hand over the cash. At this moment, they will ask, but are they still able to hand over the cash? Yeah, so whatever happens in Saudi will have an impact on Lebanon and on Egypt. Okay.
Thank you, Cyril. Yeah, I think you've already introduced Sami. So I suggest that we immediately introduce the case of Lebanon, which I think, as you rightly point out, is also in the middle of, you're talking about the toxic mix in the case of Saudi. I think in the case of Lebanon, you have even more ingredients to the mix, and I'm sure Sami will help us understand a bit better what's currently happening. Sami?
Oh, sure. Yeah, thank you. First, I would like to thank Eli for the invitation, and thanks for everyone for listening in. Basically, I'm going to be speaking about the case of Lebanon, and if I were to put a title for what I'm about to say, I would say that I'll be discussing COVID-19 as a health threat, economic threat, and as a political opportunity in Lebanon. First, I'm going to talk about the health level and the response on that level and the efficiency of the government in that. Then I'll be going into the economy because, as you all know, Lebanon has been facing quite a bit of a financial crisis here. And I will end on a note on the political situation given the protests that started in October 17. And the results of the crisis the effects of the crisis on the political scene in Lebanon so far. So on the level of the health threat that COVID-19 posed in Lebanon, it started, the first case was recorded in February 21. After that, we were quick to actually close schools and implement a 2-month forced lockdown on businesses and people, and really making it hard for people to move and go out and all of that. And we've been adopting, the Lebanese government has been adopting a tracing and isolation policy that has been quite effective and has also been backed heavily by the WHO and a healthcare system in Lebanon that is quite good. The government has been quite successful in its response to the crisis. We've been able to limit the social transmission in Lebanon. So we haven't entered the phase 4 of the pandemic. So we still have what you call local transmission up until this very moment. Today, for example, we have 11 recorded new cases, 1 of which is imported and 10 of which are actually from Lebanon, but have all been in direct contact with someone who's been infected by the virus. However, also on the level of the health, the political class was actually quick to take opportunity of the health crisis by trying to fill the gaps that the government left, especially on the level of isolation centers. So, for example, you've had many traditional political parties in Lebanon advertise themselves offering people isolation centers for them to stay in if they were infected or if they were coming back from a travel. And that has been advertised in their news agencies around the country as well. And also many political parties were quick to go and distribute PPE packages with their logos on it to many communities in Lebanon. And also the response in Lebanon was very much based on the local governance aspect. And local governance in Lebanon, as you all know, is very much tied to sectarian and political channels. So that's on the health level. On the economic level, the crisis really exacerbated a much larger crisis. The financial crisis in Lebanon actually dwarfs the COVID-19 crisis, just because it's quite immense. The Lebanese lira has lost all of its value. What used to be 1,500 lira for the US dollar now is 10,000 Lebanese lira for the US dollar. So the lockdown itself has been a double-edged sword, really. On the one hand, it exacerbated the situation for many businesses and pushed them into closure and into retrenchment efforts and firing many of their employees. But also, on the other hand, it reduced consumption, which really reduced our import bill. And given that our financial crisis has been primarily fueled by the lack of dollars in the country, that has been also, in a way, helping the Lebanese economy in a sense, because it calmed down consumption and really reduced the import bill. So it's really up to debate as to the economic threats, effects of the crisis. However, one aspect is really clear, and that is on the level of the livelihood of the people. And many businesses have been closing. According to early estimates, anywhere from 25% to 40% of total businesses have been shut down because of the crisis and the lockdown. According to the Labor Ministry today, they said that unemployment rose from 11% to 30%, and I would say that these numbers are quite modest. So the economic threat was really concentrated on the level of livelihoods. The government did try also this was an opportunity that many political parties took, and they tried to fill the gaps on the level of the social response of the government. So the government proposed an incentive package of $1,200 billion, 1,200 billion Lebanese lira to ailing businesses and to families, but that was blocked by Parliament actually for the first time, and then the second time it was approved. However, many question marks have been, or many mismanagement has been reported around this, particularly on the level of people who deserve the aid not taking it, and the distribution being based on a very clientelistic and sectarian basis. And also the parties themselves have been playing a role in maintaining some sort of social security through the direct distribution of relief packages with their logos on it. Because what happened in Lebanon really in the moment of the protests in 17 March, the power arrangement in Lebanon, which brings together all of these sectarian and political elites, was under threat. What the Covid-19 offered is a moment for the streets to calm down, for these people to recollect their ideas and to galvanize the people again. And this is what they try to do through the distribution of these services and the buying back, in a sense, the allegiance of the people. And also on the level, what the Corona crisis has offered these politicians is also a way, some time for them to align their interests on the level of the financial crisis. And this is something that we have been seeing quite clearly, and I will not go into the details of the finances, but just to say quite quickly, Lebanon has losses in its financial system that are estimated at $83 to $100 billion. We've asked the IMF to come here, and the IMF has been, and the government prepared some sort of a plan to respond to this crisis. The plan really says that we need to deal with the crisis now. We need to deal with the crisis as if they're realized, with these losses as if they're realized, and we cannot carry anything forward. However, this would really threaten the interests of the political and business elite, who are one and the same, because many of these political elites have used the banking sector as a mechanism for redistribution of public and private functions. So they take the money from the depositors, give it to the government then pays the people back through services, employment, whatever, and pays back the 1% through giving them really high interest rates. So the government, what it was doing was subsidizing subsidizing for the poor and subsidizing for the rich. So any banking restructuring effort, which would be mandated by the IMF, would really threaten this mechanism, which is a pillar for the political elite and for the political system in Lebanon. And during the crisis, an alternative that takes the IMF out of the question, which is based on carrying losses. They load the losses up to a point where banks will not actually become insolvent, and then selling state assets to bail out banks. So in a way, what the political class currently, after the coronavirus pandemic gave them breathing room, decided that they will run an epic effort to redistribute public wealth to the 1%. And this is another thing that has been doing, because any reform effort that it will take will certainly mean that the entire structure will crumble. So this is another effect for the coronavirus in Lebanon. And I think I will end at this point. And happy to share more insights in the Q&A.
Well, many thanks. I think it's very good to finish on Lebanon. And also, I think you addressed it in a way which very nicely and very interestingly linked together the three levels of the crisis. And I would be interested in asking a few questions, but I think we can probably start opening the discussion to the participants who are online with us. So I don't know whether some of you already have questions, whether you want to write them down, whether, Stefano, can you help us on this? How do we start? I haven't seen any question yet, but I think time has come and it's good if we can open the floor. If not, I'm sure it's also, we could have also a good opportunity to have the speakers maybe asking questions to one another, because there are probably some interesting points of comparison and probably food for thought in the four presentations. So from the participants, the audience, we don't have anything yet. So among the speakers, is there anybody, anyone from you that would like to react to the other speakers' presentations? Nothing special? Then if nothing pops up, I would like maybe to try and jump on Sami's last points and the way he thinks that the necessary restructuring of the banking system